My life was a collection of quiet things. The dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light of the museum's atrium, the whisper of rubber-soled shoes on polished marble, the almost imperceptible hum of the climate control systems preserving artifacts far older and more important than myself. For 10 years, I had been the curator of antiquities, a custodian of forgotten stories etched in clay and stone. My own story, however, felt unwritten, a blank scroll gathering dust in a forgotten corner of my own heart. I existed in the hushed spaces between exhibits, a ghost in my own life, observing but never truly participating. Loneliness had become a familiar cloak, heavy but comforting in its predictability. My world was ordered, catalogued, and safe, and I was profoundly, achingly alone. Then came Ethan. He wasn't an artifact. He was a force of nature that disrupted the museum's placid ecosystem. He was a new security guard, hired to replace old Mr. Henderson, who had retired after a lifetime of benevolent napping in the Egyptian wing. Where Henderson had been soft and round and smelled faintly of mothballs and peppermint, Ethan was solid and sharp-edged. He had the kind of quiet stillness that wasn't passive but coiled, like a predator at rest. His uniform, a simple navy blue blazer and trousers, seemed tailored to his broad shoulders and lean frame in a way that was almost unfair. He moved with an economy of motion, his steps sure and silent on the floors I knew so well. The first time I really saw him, not just as a new uniform in my peripheral vision, was on a Tuesday. I was agonizing over the placement of a new collection of Roman glass, the delicate iridescent fragments looking fragile and lost in the cavernous display case. I was muttering to myself, a habit born of years of solitary work. "It's too crowded on the left," a voice said, low and steady. It was like the gentle rumble of distant thunder, a sound that vibrated in my chest. I jumped, dropping a velvet placement cloth. I turned to see him standing a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. His expression was unreadable, his eyes a deep, ambiguous shade of hazel that seemed to absorb the light. There was no judgment in his gaze, only calm observation. "The weight is off," he continued, nodding toward the case. "Your eye is drawn to the cluster of blue, but the single amber piece on the right gets lost. It needs a friend." I stared at him, my mouth slightly agape. Most of the guards saw the exhibits as obstacles on their patrol routes. They didn't see the art, the balance, the story. I, the curator, the expert, had been so focused on the historical timeline that I had missed the simple aesthetics. He was right. The amber piece looked lonely. It looked like me. "You're right," I managed, my voice sounding thin and reedy compared to his. I bent to retrieve the cloth, my face hot. A hand was there before mine. His hand. It was large and calloused, the fingers long and capable. He picked up the cloth and handed it to me, his fingers brushing against mine for a fraction of a second. A jolt, small but unmistakable, shot up my arm. It was nothing. A static shock. An accident. But my heart hammered against my ribs as if it were a major event. "Thanks," I mumbled, snatching my hand back. He just gave a slight nod, his gaze lingering on my face for a moment before moving back to the display. Just a thought. Then he turned and continued his patrol, his presence receding down the long hall, leaving a strange, vibrating silence in his wake. I stood there for a full minute, the velvet cloth clutched in my hand, my pulse thrumming with the memory of that fleeting, insignificant touch. After that day, Ethan occupied a significant and unsettling amount of my mental real estate. My observations, once reserved for the subtle decay of ancient papyrus or the craquelure on a Renaissance portrait, were now trained on him. I learned the rhythm of his patrols, the way he'd pause for precisely 30 seconds in front of the Hellenistic sculptures, his head tilted as if listening to their silent marble secrets. I noticed the faint scar that bisected his left eyebrow, a tiny white line that only became visible when the light hit it just right. I learned that he brought his lunch every day in a battered metal lunchbox, the kind a construction worker might carry, and that he always ate alone in the small, sterile staff break room. I found myself inventing reasons to be in his path. A query about a flickering light in Gallery C. A feigned concern about the humidity levels near the medieval tapestries. Each interaction was a carefully orchestrated microdrama in my head. I would rehearse my lines, only to have them evaporate into stammering nonsense the moment he turned his steady gaze on me. He, for his part, was always polite, always professional. Yet, there were moments, tiny fissures in his stoic facade, that I clung to. A hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth when I dropped a stack of papers. The way his eyes would find mine across a crowded room during a donor event, holding my gaze for a beat too long before looking away. I was a scholar of minutiae, and Ethan was my most compelling subject. I analyzed his every gesture, his every word, searching for subtext, for a sign that this strange pull I felt wasn't entirely one-sided. One afternoon, I was installing a new sign for the Mesopotamian exhibit. I was on a small stepladder, struggling to align the bracket. My hands were trembling slightly, my frustration mounting. I hated tasks that required a combination of height and fine motor skills. "Need a hand, Leo?" His voice, right behind me. I startled, wobbling precariously on the step. A firm hand landed on the small of my back, steadying me. The warmth of his palm seeped through the thin fabric of my shirt, a solid, grounding pressure that made my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't a fleeting, accidental brush. It was a deliberate, supportive touch. It stayed there for a long moment, even after I had regained my balance. My mind went completely blank. All I could feel was the heat of his hand, the solid presence of him behind me, the faint, clean scent of his soap mixed with something uniquely him, something like cedar and cold air. Yes. Please. I finally managed to choke out. He didn't say anything else. He simply took the bracket and the screwdriver from my trembling hands. I stepped down from the ladder, my back still tingling where his hand had been. I watched him, my designated observer, as he effortlessly secured the sign. His movements were fluid and precise. The muscles in his forearm flexed as he turned the screwdriver, and I found myself staring, mesmerized by the simple, masculine grace of the action. He finished and stepped back, wiping his hands on his trousers. He turned to me, and for the first time, I saw a genuine, unambiguous smile. It wasn't a big smile, just a slight upturn of his lips, but it transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making his eyes crinkle at the corners. "There," he said. "All set." "Thank you, Ethan," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I was struggling. "We all need a hand sometimes," he replied, his smile fading back into that familiar, neutral expression. But his eyes held mine for a second longer than necessary. In that second, I felt a dizzying, terrifying wave of hope. It was a dangerous feeling, one I hadn't allowed myself to entertain in years. It felt like standing on the edge of a great height, both wanting to leap and being terrified of the fall. The weeks bled into one another, each day marked by these small, charged moments. The tension between us became a third entity, a silent companion on our rounds through the quiet galleries. It was in the way we'd stand a little too close while examining a document, our shoulders brushing, sending shivers down my spine. It was in the shared, knowing glances over the heads of noisy school groups. It was in the comfortable silences that fell between us in the break room, silences that felt more intimate than any conversation I'd ever had. The museum decided to host a Museum by Moonlight event, a late-night affair with cocktails and live jazz, designed to attract younger donors. It meant a long, grueling night for the staff. I was required to be on hand to answer questions, and Ethan was assigned to the main atrium, the heart of the event. Dressed in my best suit, which still felt like a costume, I felt even more out of place than usual. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the loud, performative laughter of the city's elite. I hovered near the Grecian pottery, feeling like one of the relics. I watched Ethan from across the room. He was a pillar of calm in the swirling chaos. He stood by the main entrance, his posture relaxed but alert, his gaze sweeping the crowd with an unhurried professionalism that I found endlessly captivating. He looked impossibly handsome, the formal setting making his ruggedness stand out even more. Late in the evening, during a lull, I escaped to the deserted Mesoamerican wing. The quiet was a balm. The air was cool and still. I stood in front of a display of Mayan hieroglyphs, tracing the intricate carvings with my eyes, trying to ground myself. Hiding. Ethan's voice made me jump for the second time in our acquaintance. He was leaning against the doorframe, his jacket off, his tie loosened. He looked tired, but his eyes were bright. "Just taking a breath," I admitted. It's a lot out there. He nodded, walking slowly into the gallery. He stopped beside me, not too close, but near enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. We stood in silence for a long time, looking at the ancient stones. The jazz from the atrium was a faint, melodic pulse in the distance. "Do you ever wonder what they were trying to say?" he asked, his voice soft. He gestured to the glyphs. Not just the literal translation, but what they really felt. Fear, hope. Did they worry about things? It was the most vulnerable thing he had ever said to me. It cracked open his stoic shell, revealing a glimpse of the introspective man within. It was a question I had spent my entire career pondering, but hearing it from him, in this quiet, stolen moment, made it feel new and profound. All the time, I confessed, turning to look at him. His face was shadowed, but I could see the earnestness in his expression. I think that's all history is. Just people worrying about things. Loving people they shouldn't, fearing the future, hoping for a good harvest. We're not so different. Our eyes met, and the air crackled with all the unspoken things. The space between us felt electric, a vacuum begging to be filled. I could see the slight flutter of a pulse in his throat. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I had a wild, insane urge to close the distance between us, to reach out and touch his face, to see if he was real. I am here. He is here. Just us. The thought screamed in my head. But the moment was broken by the sharp crackle of his radio. A call from another guard about a minor issue. He sighed, the spell shattering. "I should," he started, gesturing vaguely with his thumb back toward the noise. "Yes, of course," I said, my voice flat with disappointment. He hesitated for a second, his eyes searching mine. "Leo," he said, his voice low and serious. "Are you okay?" It was the same question he'd asked before, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just a pleasantry. He was really asking. He saw me. He saw the loneliness I tried so hard to hide. Tears pricked my eyes, and I looked away, mortified. "I'm fine," I lied, my voice thick. He didn't push. He just stood there for another beat, then gave a small nod. "See you later," he said softly, and left me alone with the silent stones and the deafening sound of my own cowardice. I stayed there until the last of the guests had gone, my heart a heavy, aching weight in my chest. I had been given a chance, a small opening, and I had let it close. The days following the moonlight event were excruciating. A new, awkward tension had settled between us. The comfortable silences were gone, replaced by a strained quiet. We avoided eye contact. Our brief interactions were clipped and formal. I was convinced I had ruined everything, that my flash of emotional transparency had scared him off. He probably thought I was some pathetic, lonely man, which, of course, I was. The thought was a constant, humiliating refrain in my mind. I replayed our conversation in the gallery over and over, dissecting every word, every pause. Had I imagined the intensity, the connection? Perhaps I had projected my own desperate yearning onto a simple moment of shared fatigue. He was just being nice. A kind, perceptive man who had no idea the havoc he was wreaking on my carefully ordered world. The hope that had bloomed within me withered and died, leaving a bitter taste. I threw myself into my work with a renewed, almost frantic energy. I organized storerooms, rewrote catalog entries, planned exhibits for years in the future. I tried to bury myself in the safe, predictable world of the past, a world where feelings were petrified in stone and could no longer hurt anyone. I tried to rebuild the walls around my heart, brick by painful brick. But I was still aware of him. Always. A shadow at the edge of my vision, a low voice on the radio, a solid presence that my body seemed to have memorized. I would feel him enter a room before I saw him, a subtle shift in the air, a prickling on my skin. It was maddening. He was a ghost haunting the halls of my life, a constant reminder of what I was too afraid to want. One Thursday, about 2 weeks after the event, a sudden cold snap hit the city. The temperature plummeted, and a biting wind howled through the streets. I had been so engrossed in my work that I hadn't even looked out a window all day. By the time I was packing up to leave, the sun had long set, and the museum was quiet and empty, save for the night staff. I said a brief, stilted goodnight to Ethan, who was stationed at the main security desk, his eyes on the monitors. He just grunted in response, not looking up. The rejection, however small, was a sharp sting. I pulled on my coat, wrapped my favorite scarf around my neck, a thick, woolen thing in a pattern of muted grays and blues that my grandmother had knit for me years ago, and stepped out into the brutal cold. The wind hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath. I hunched my shoulders and began the brisk walk to the subway station, my mind already churning with the familiar cycle of self-recrimination and loneliness. I was halfway down the block, lost in my miserable thoughts, when I heard it. "Leo," the voice cut through the wail of the wind. I stopped and turned, my heart giving a painful lurch. It was Ethan. He was jogging toward me, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He wasn't wearing a coat, just his uniform blazer, and he was holding something in his hand. My scarf. I must have dropped it. I reached up to my neck, feeling the bare, cold skin. I hadn't secured it properly. How could I be so careless? He reached me, his chest heaving slightly. He wasn't smiling. His face was serious, his brow furrowed with an intensity that made my stomach clench. The streetlights cast a golden glow on him, making the condensation on his hair sparkle like tiny diamonds. "You dropped this," he said, his voice a little rough from the cold and the run. He held out the scarf. "Oh, thank you," I said, my voice sounding small and thin against the wind. I reached for it, but he didn't hand it to me. Instead, he took a step closer, closing the small space between us. The world seemed to narrow, the city sounds fading into a distant hum. All I could see was his face, his eyes searching mine. All I could feel was the biting cold on my cheeks and the confusing, terrifying warmth that was starting to build in my chest. He lifted his hands and, with a slow, deliberate motion, began to wrap the scarf around my neck. My breath hitched. This was not a casual gesture. His movements were careful, methodical. He looped the soft wool around once, then twice, his knuckles brushing against the sensitive skin of my jaw. The touch was electric, 1,000 times more potent than the accidental brushes of the past. It was intentional. It was intimate. He took his time, his gaze never leaving my face. I could see the dark flecks in his hazel eyes, could see the way his pupils had dilated slightly. He smoothed the ends of the scarf down over my coat, his fingers lingering on my collarbone for a heart-stopping moment. His hands were so warm. The simple act felt like a sacrament, a ritual. He was wrapping me up, protecting me from the cold, but it felt like so much more. It felt like he was shielding me from everything else, too. The loneliness, the fear. My heart is going to beat its way out of my chest. I can't breathe. He's so close. Don't let this end. He finally let his hands drop, but he didn't step back. He stood there, inches away, the silence between us thick with unspoken words, with weeks of tension, with a fragile, terrifying hope. The wind whipped a strand of his dark hair across his forehead. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet, almost lost in the wind, but I heard it as clearly as if he had shouted it. "See you tomorrow?" It wasn't a statement. It was a question, but it wasn't about work. It wasn't about another day of patrols and exhibits. It was a question about us. It was a plea and a promise all in one. It was asking if the fragile thing that had been growing between us in the silent galleries was real. It was asking if we could step out of the shadows of subtext and into the light. It was asking for permission to hope. The relief that washed over me was so immense, so powerful, it almost brought me to my knees. The fear that had been my constant companion for weeks, for years, finally receded. It wasn't all in my head. This was real. I couldn't find my voice. All I could do was nod, a single, jerky motion. But it was enough. A slow smile spread across his face. Not the small, polite smile from before, but a wide, genuine, brilliant smile that lit up his entire being. It was like watching the sun rise after a long, dark night. "Yeah," I finally whispered, the word a puff of white in the cold air. "Tomorrow." He held my gaze for another moment, his smile softening into something tender. Then he gave a final, small nod, turned, and jogged back toward the warm, bright entrance of the museum, leaving me standing on the cold pavement, wrapped in the warmth of his gesture, with the impossible, beautiful promise of tomorrow ringing in my ears. I touched the scarf at my neck. It felt different now. It felt like a promise. The walk to the subway was a blur. I didn't feel the cold anymore. I felt incandescent. The next morning, however, the incandescence had been replaced by a familiar, gut-wrenching anxiety. The light of day had a way of making nighttime magic seem like foolish illusion. I stood outside the museum, my hand on the heavy brass door handle, my heart hammering. What if I had imagined it all? What if the grand significance I had placed on a simple, kind gesture was just another product of my lonely, overactive imagination? What if he walked in today and acted like nothing had happened? The thought was unbearable. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and walked in. The atrium was bathed in the cool morning light. And there he was. He was standing near the information desk, talking to another guard. He looked up as I entered, and our eyes met across the expanse of marble. For a terrifying second, his expression was blank, unreadable. My stomach plummeted. I knew it. It was a dream. But then, his eyes crinkled at the corners. He gave me a slow, almost imperceptible nod, and the corner of his mouth tilted up in a private smile. It was a tiny gesture, one that no one else would ever notice. But it was for me. It was a confirmation. A silent, yes, it was real. I'm still here. The breath I hadn't realized I was holding whooshed out of me. A wave of warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the last of the anxious chill. I gave him a small, shaky smile in return before heading toward my office, my legs feeling strangely light. The day passed in a haze of quiet joy. The awkwardness between us was gone, replaced by a new, thrilling awareness. Every time our paths crossed, a current of electricity passed between us. A shared glance over a display case felt like a secret conversation. When he handed me a schedule, his fingers brushed mine, and this time, I didn't pull away. I let the touch linger, a silent acknowledgement of the new territory we were navigating. That afternoon, I found him in the Hellenistic Gallery, his favorite spot. He wasn't looking at the sculptures. He was looking at me as I approached. "Hi," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Hi," he replied. The silence that fell between us was comfortable, easy. It was filled not with tension, but with anticipation. I started, my old awkwardness making a brief cameo. "I wanted to thank you. For last night. For the scarf. It was cold," he said simply, his gaze steady. "Didn't want you to freeze." The words were mundane, but his eyes said something else entirely. They said, "I was worried about you. I wanted an excuse to touch you. I wanted you to know I see you." "Still," I said, my heart feeling too big for my chest. "Thank you." He took a step closer. "Leo," he said, and my name on his lips was a physical touch. "I get off at 5, it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an offering." "Me too," I heard myself say. "I thought maybe," he paused, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was endearing. The unflappable Ethan was nervous. "Maybe we could get a coffee? Or something." The simple invitation felt more momentous than any grand declaration. It was the next step. A step out of the museum, out of our prescribed roles, and into the real world. Together. "I'd like that," I said, and the smile that broke across my face felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I'd like that very much." We met outside that evening, just as we had the night before. But this time, it was different. There was no pretense, no ambiguity. As we started walking, our hands brushed against each other. After a few feet, Ethan's fingers tentatively found mine, lacing through them. His hand was large and warm, and it fit against mine perfectly. It felt like coming home. We didn't talk much as we walked to a small, quiet coffee shop a few blocks away. We didn't need to. The simple, solid connection of our hands said everything. We sat at a small table in the corner, the steam from our cups swirling between us. And we talked. We talked for hours. He told me about growing up in a small town, about the army, about the series of loud, chaotic jobs that had led him to seek the quiet of the museum. He told me he'd been watching me for months, intrigued by the quiet, sad man who seemed to love the broken things of the world so much. I told him about my quiet life, about my passion for history, about the loneliness that had been my shadow for so long. I told him how I felt like an artifact myself sometimes, something to be observed but not touched. Saying the words out loud to him didn't feel pathetic or shameful. It just felt honest. He listened, his gaze never wavering, making me feel like I was the most fascinating story he had ever heard. As we left the coffee shop and walked back into the cold night, he stopped me under a streetlight, just as he had the night before. He didn't say anything. He just reached up and gently adjusted my scarf, his fingers brushing my cheek. Then he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a desperate, frantic kiss. It was slow and soft and sure. It was a kiss that tasted of coffee and cold air and the promise of tomorrow. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was everything I had been too afraid to even dream of. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, our breath mingling in a single white cloud. "This is real," he whispered, as if to reassure himself as much as me. "Yes," I breathed, closing my eyes, savoring the feeling of his warmth, his solidity. "It's real." In the weeks that followed, my life transformed. The quiet was still there, but it was no longer the quiet of emptiness. It was the quiet of contentment. It was the sound of two people reading in the same room, the comfortable silence of a shared meal, the gentle rhythm of another person's breathing in the dark. Ethan's presence filled all the empty spaces in my life I hadn't even known were there. The museum, once my sanctuary from the world, became the backdrop to our quiet love story. A stolen kiss behind a tapestry, a shared smile across a crowded gallery, his hand finding the small of my back as we passed in a hallway. My colleagues probably noticed a change in me. I smiled more. I walked with a lighter step. The sadness he had seen in me had been replaced by a quiet, steady joy. One Saturday, he took me hiking upstate. We stood on a ridge overlooking a valley filled with the fiery colors of autumn. The air was crisp and clean. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. We stood there for a long time, just breathing together, watching the sunlight move across the landscape. "I like this," I said softly. "Me too," he murmured into my ear. "The quiet suits you," he paused. "You seem happy, Leo." I turned in his arms to face him, my hands resting on his chest. I looked into his steady, hazel eyes, the eyes that had seen me from the very beginning. "I am," I said, and the truth of it was so simple, so profound. "I feel like I've been waiting a long time." "Me too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just didn't know what I was waiting for." He kissed me then, a deep, unhurried kiss that spoke of patience and certainty and a future I was no longer afraid of. My life was still a collection of quiet things. The warmth of his hand in mine, the low rumble of his voice, the steady beat of his heart against my ear in the middle of the night. But these were not the quiet things of loneliness. They were the quiet things of love. I was no longer an observer of stories. I was finally living my own. And it was more beautiful than any artifact I had ever cared for. It was real, and it was ours, and it had all started with a dropped scarf and the simple, hopeful promise of tomorrow.